Labour has announced it will strip private schools of valuable tax breaks unless they do more to help the state sector. It's the latest of Labour's major policy proposals ahead of the general election next May. The Shadow Education Secretary, Tristram Hunt, himself the product of a private education, says he would break down what he calls the Berlin Wall in our education system and recast the relationship between state and private schools. He wants to break down the divide between private and state education by making private schools enter into partnerships with the state sector. If they fail to meet Labour's new schools partnership standard, they'll lose the subsidy they currently receive through business rates relief, estimated to be worth around £700 million over the course of the next Parliament. In order to meet the partnership standard, they must provide qualified teachers in specialist subjects to state schools, share expertise to help state school students get into top universities, and run joint extracurricular programmes. Tristram Hunt made those announcements in a speech this morning at Walthamstow Academy. He questioned whether private schools were currently earning the tax breaks they receive.
So far as I can work out, roughly 3% of private schools sponsor or co-sponsor an academy. A further 5% loan teaching staff to a state school, whilst only a third bother to open their doors for maintained school pupils to attend certain lessons or other educational events. On that basis, it would seem that Sir Michael Wilshaw is absolutely right to say that their focus needs to be less Dubai and more Derby. And the only possible answer to whether they earn their £700 million subsidy is a resounding and unequivocal no.
Tristram Hunt there. Well, I'm joined now by Labour's Shadow Schools Minister KELVIN Brennan and Charlotte VERE, Acting General Secretary of the Independent Schools Council and Head of the Girls' Schools Association. Welcome to both of you. First of all, KELVIN Brennan, Labour doesn't think that the private schools earn those tax breaks. Is that the reason that you are trying to put pressure on them to do more and threaten them with taking away that money that they currently get?
Well, yes. I mean, we've just heard about the social chasm that exists in our society, and we want to break down those barriers between the private sector and the state sector, and by bringing in a schools partnership standard to make sure that we can actually quantify that and show that it is actually happening, because private schools do get discretionary rate relief on their business rates up to the value of £700 million over this current Parliament, and in exchange for that they should do more. And it's not just me who's saying that. That's what Sir Anthony Selden says, the outgoing head teacher of Wellington College. That's what the head of Ofsted, Sir Michael Wilshaw, says. And I think for society we ought to be trying to break down these barriers between the state sector and the private sector. Some do very well already, as we've heard from Tristram's speech. Some do sponsor academies, some do things like sharing teachers, but we need to see far more of that. And so far, sort of warm words have not achieved that. So we do need this kind of inspected, proper standard that we can show that those schools have earned that rate relief.
Why do private schools deserve tax breaks at all?
Because they're charities, and of course many of them have been charities for generations, and so to suddenly say that all of a sudden we're going to take independent schools and take away this charitable benefit is a nonsense. But I think the point is that over 90% of all independent schools that are charities do two things. They are involved in work outside their school gates, and that can be partnerships, it can be sponsoring academies, it can be all sorts of things. And the second thing they do is they provide bursaries for children from low-income families.
Do all private schools do that?
All private schools that are charities, yes.
Right. The charitable status issue, of course, was disputed by Labour before, and you put rules in place. They were overturned, weren't they, by the courts? So, I mean, the question. So the question is, if we accept that they are charities and they have this charitable status, are they actually doing enough, despite what you say, to actually earn it and deserve that money? People pay an awful lot of money to go to private schools. The figures from Tristram Hunt is that 3% sponsor an academy. That's a very low figure.
Well, I think the issue is that independent schools are hugely diverse. At one end, we do have the very large, the Eton, the Westminsters of this world, and they sponsor academies because they can. But at the other end, we have non-selective schools who take in the children of aspirational parents. And these are not institutions that can actually afford to sponsor academies, but they can do other things. And what we don't need is some government diktat coming down from a Labour government saying, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. Oh, and by the way, here's a whole new raft of regulations which the schools must then comply with and pay for that. Well, it's just ridiculous. It's no nonsense.
Well, answer that.
Well, in actual fact, all we're asking them to do in many cases is what their original purposes that those schools were set up for. I mean, it's quite right. Many of them have been around for a long time, and many were set up to educate the poor.
It's what we're doing already.
They've evolved over and they're not educating overwhelmingly the poor. And they've evolved in some cases, these are not my words, to evolve in the oligarchs of our society is what they're doing. So we're asking more from them in return for that public benefit. And I'd like to see the other political parties join us in this, actually, so that it isn't just a Labour initiative. I think the Conservatives should support this. David Cameron said the same thing about the need to break down this Berlin Wall. I think the Liberal Democrats ought to support us as well, and the other political parties too, because if we're going to be serious about this social chasm that's opening up in our society, we should be prepared to do this. And I'm quite surprised at the attitude that's been taken, because many head teachers of private schools and of very large independent schools agree with what we're saying.
Why are you so reluctant to share the expertise and resources with the state sector?
That is not right at all. We're not reluctant at all, and this is what I'm trying to say.
But you said that certain schools can't afford to do it and therefore shouldn't have to do it.
They can't afford to sponsor an academy.
Right.
But they do plenty of other things. I mean, we were talking about Sir William Perkins School just earlier, and they do an awful lot of outreach work in terms of getting local communities together to get children into universities.
And under our
These are
proposal,
all the sorts of things. But can I just go back to one point about this tax relief issue? We are saying, well, you are saying, £147 million a year. Our schools, total, provide bursaries of £660 million a year. That is because you, before the 2010 election, that's what Labour Party wanted. That was your policy. You wanted us to build up our bursaries.
And is anything wrong with that?
That's what we did, and there's nothing wrong with that.
And you support that?
But now we're switching. Now we're saying, well, OK, it's not bursaries anymore. We want this. We actually just need a level playing field. If this is the best education policy that Labour can come up with, it is ridiculous.
Well, it's not ridiculous. It's a very reasonable and moderate proposal. And in fact, all it would require is for private schools to demonstrate that they are fulfilling that public benefit. They're already inspected by the Independent Schools Inspectorate in the most part. They would inspect the schools and judge whether or not that partnership standard had been met. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable requirement for schools that are getting tax relief for the activities that they carry out.
Just before I come to you, it is about justifying that tax relief, isn't it, Charlotte? So why would Sir Michael Wilshaw have said that private schools are only offering crumbs off their tables to the state sector? That's pretty damning.
Well, that's Michael Wilshaw's view, and of course he runs...
Is he wrong?
Yes, of course he's very, very wrong.
But he's a man in a position of authority and experience.
He's a man who runs Ofsted and often comments on other areas of education policy which perhaps are not within his remit. But, I think we have to be absolutely clear here. We are already doing this partnership work. The Charity Commission looks at our charities and said, yes, you are delivering public benefit. That's absolutely clear. So all Labour is simply adding is a layer of bureaucracy.
If you have a look at what the schools themselves declare as their public benefit in some cases, sometimes it's just purely tokenistic. And Charlotte was saying about schools doing things outside their school gates. That doesn't necessarily equate to really getting involved in the local community and really supporting education in the whole area, which is what they should be doing.
Kelvin MacKenzie, has Labour got a point here?
Well, actually, I think today the answer is that the schools should give up their charitable status. They are part of a privately funded area of education. And I think to stop this argument once and for all, they simply have to say, that's it. I mean, when you look at the explosion in prices of going into the independent sector for your education, I'm astonished that anybody can actually afford it. I mean, they say it's for oligarchs. I'm surprised the oligarchs aren't squealing, to be honest. So I would say let's end this argument once and for all. Let's stop all this. They are trying to make money. They are fantastic facilities. They are stunning teachers, turning out brilliant kids who are running our country and most of industry. We want to encourage them in that area, and I think we should take them out of politics so that you guys can't spend your entire time bitching and moaning about it.
What do you say to that?
Well, I think, you know, that's just a nonsense because, of course, you can't suddenly turn a charity into a non-charity overnight because it's a very, very complex thing.
But you have been challenged before, haven't you? I mean, this has gone to the courts. In the end, where will this dispute actually be resolved?
Well, my biggest concern is that if, you know, there is not the charitable status, then actually there would be no incentive for our schools to be providing the £660 million of bursaries. And that is surely a bad thing for social mobility.
And that would change everything, wouldn't it, Kevin Brennan? Because if you took away the charitable status, all of a sudden there would be a proper market for privatising the independent sector, if you like. And it might go from educating 7% of our pupils to an awful lot more.
Well, we're not proposing to take away the charitable status.
But you'd like
we have been trying over many years to get some of these charities to take their public benefit obligations more seriously. But what we're saying in this proposal is that for the tax breaks that they get as a result of that charitable status, they'll no longer be able to get them unless they can demonstrate that public benefit. Kelvin is right. It is in the decision of the private schools themselves if they wish to remove themselves from charitable status to do that. Many of them may want to branch out into overseas, you know, activities more. We don't want that to be subsidised, obviously, by the taxpayer, and that option's available to them if they don't want to fulfil this test, which we're saying they should do.
I mean, Charlotte, you sound unhappy with the fact that you say a Labour government forced you to do more in terms of bursaries, but sponsoring academies is just one way, as you said, of private schools earning their keep, if you like. But what about the other areas that you've talked about? Do they rent out or share their playing fields, for example? How many bursaries are given from an average private school to parents on low incomes?
Well, it wasn't a case of being forced, but I mean, it's something that, for example, since 2010, when obviously there was no longer a Labour government, bursaries have actually gone up by 27% in our schools. 1/3 of all of our children get assistance with their fees.
And what's the percentage assistance in bursaries? Is it 10%?
I don't have that figure at the moment, but it is £660 million a year, so it is a significant amount of money. And we do it not because a Labour government told us to, but what I was trying to illustrate, there's flip-flopping around, meddling around the edges. We've got to understand here, the independent sector is 1/20th the size of the state sector. We cannot be a magic bullet. This is education policy gone absolutely mad. You know, come up with some big picture ideas to help the children of this country.
Right, because in the end, isn't this a bit of a blunt instrument to try and tackle social mobility?
Well, I think that to describe it as education policy gone absolutely mad is a ridiculous hyperbole, to be perfectly honest. A perfectly moderate and reasonable decision to say demonstrate the public benefit you're getting for the tax relief you're getting as a result of your activities. And I think the overreaction, really, that we're hearing is ridiculous when compared with the reasonable position being taken by many people who actually work in the private sector and run schools and are actually running academies.
Instead of focusing on 5 to 7%, why don't you focus on the shocking education that 93 to 95% of the country is getting? And so what you're doing is you're deflecting.
Well, hang on.
You're deflecting the whole argument.
Yeah,
because that is a very useful deflection on your part by saying that 93% are getting a shocking education.
Are getting a poor education.
Kelvin MacKenzie, what's that based on? You know, 93% are getting a shocking.
I have relatives who are teachers, right? They put their head in their hands in the manner in which they have to conduct their classroom.
Anecdotal stories from your relatives, Kelvin, does not constitute evidence.
Right? You concentrate on the 95%. Leave the 5% alone.
We will leave it there. Thank you both very much.